All right. Well, thanks for everyone for coming. Today, we're joined by Professor Alex Stajkovic and Kayla Stajkovic. Professor Stajkovic is a researcher and professor of organized behavior within the Department of Management in the UW School of Business. And Professor Surgeon is a gender and leadership researcher and professor within the Department of Management at Edgewood College. So both very close by. And today they'll be talking with us about their new research surrounding women in leadership positions during COVID-19 and the pandemic. This research has been highlighted in WebMD, Harvard Business Review, BBC News, Bloomberg, Washington Post, and Forbes magazine, just to name a few. So with that, please help me welcome Professor Surgeon and Stajkovic.
Okay, thank you, Brian. I'm glad to be back. I was teaching my undergrad class in the fall. So just a quick thumbs up and down. How's everything going? COVID and all that, better or same or kind of worse? I'm just trying to get a feel of the room. Kind of same, better. Well, at least nobody's down. So yeah, we got something going there. So I just thought I'd check with you to make sure. So I assume you can see the slides. So Kayla and I are just going to split it sort of half-half. And I said we only have 3 slides. So the first one is, so we're presenting a paper, right? I mean, not necessarily as we would do maybe at a conference or something, but it's not just, we're not just pulling this out of the blue. There was a paper we thought we'd like to tell you what it was. And it's right there. So we got a little bit, as Brian said, we got a little bit of attention off of it. And we can talk about that later if we would like to. So what I'm going to do, I was going to give a little bit of a social context, sort of like where's this topic coming from, a little bit of a research background, issues with both, and then just chat a little bit what we did as sort of big picture and what we found. So hopefully I'm done in about 5 minutes, 10 the most. If you want to jump in, by all means.
He's not going to be done in 5 minutes. I don't think I've ever heard him talk and finish in 5 minutes before. So.
But I say that so people think, oh, well, no, the truth is if you let me talk, I will. So that's the problem. Do not let me talk. Just jump anytime. So here is a little bit here what we're talking about. Even before the COVID started, there was this notion that women might be more effective leaders than men in a crisis. That was the big one, right? In a crisis. And a lot of that has been done. When COVID started, those who, if you wish, got on the ball right away, they were starting to put out, oh, look, it certainly looks like it. I mean, take a look at this. Look at German Chancellor, look at New Zealand. I mean, they seem to be doing great, clearly, right? I mean, women might be better in a crisis than men, except that a lot of that was sort of a first hint, right? It wasn't, there were no studies, it wasn't analyzed, there were no data. People were just kind of saying that to be first, I think, to kind of report something like that. Now, if you look at the research, there has been research on this, on something very, very similar, which is, these are just few examples. Like in politics, there is data. And by the way, any sites you want, they're in the paper, but you can also email us. We'd be happy to share with you if you wanted to read any of these. That the women are encouraged to run for the hard-to-win elections. So that's an empirical fact. That's out there. We had a very similar finding in the legal aspect with hard-to-win cases, that they put more litigators who are female if they have those. In business, we have enough evidence, mostly from 2008, during the crisis, that banks that had CEOs were not experiencing such a severe failures, right? I mean, even though if they did go down in some way, it wasn't as bad compared to male CEOs. And then there is a serious empirical evidence that there is a growing number of women on the boards of directors. That's also a fact. So that's kind of where the research was. And now the notion came out that maybe we have a female leadership advantage, that maybe there's an advantage to have female leaders in a crisis, right? And that would be incredible finding if we can actually differentiate that somebody is clearly a better leader in a crisis, because that's kind of when we need leadership the most, right? If we have a complete turmoil, We need somebody sort of to show us the way and to kind of tell us where to go and what to do. But the critics were very quick, as soon as this female leadership advantage came out, to point to two issues. One is they would say, well, what is really a crisis? How do you define crisis, right? And they would go back and say, are failing profits a crisis? Certainly it's not a desirable thing, but is that really a crisis? Hard to win cases, is that a crisis in per se, right? So that was a lot of pushback there, that those maybe might not be really a representations of a crisis. And the other one was this called glass cliff phenomena. And that was, somebody brought up and said that the growing number of women on boards of directors, for example, or as CEOs of companies, or as senior leaders, is that the result of we actually wanted to promote more women, or is that perhaps the result of promoting women to positions that others didn't want, that they're actually putting you on a glass cliff? They're too easy to fail, right? Meaning companies have already gone bankrupt and then we appoint women, or they're really going down and then we appoint when others are kind of bailing out. And there is quite a bit of evidence for that. So that was a little bit of a surprise, like, oh, okay, we didn't think of that. So that was the context on this particular question before our study. And Kayla is going to take it from there and kind of tell you what we did, why, what we found.
And so, and from that perspective, so people, this glass cliff research was kind of saying, look, women are getting promoted to positions that are inherently prone to failure, kind of viewing it from a negative thing. And when we started digging into this research, we saw it from a different angle, which is that, well, maybe when things are rocky and getting tough, maybe the women's leadership style is actually more needed in those types of contexts and situations. And so that's where then we extended it and we tested it in COVID. But you could say, okay, well, why do you think women's leadership style might be more needed in these crisis contexts that Alex just talked about? And so what the prior literature had suggested is that when it comes to things like creativity and intuition and being flexible in your thinking versus kind of linear, that women tend to have those qualities more than men. Also, women leaders have a tendency to foster more collaboration. And when you think about a crisis, usually there's not one expert in the room, like there might be during normal business operations, because typically nobody's experienced the crisis before, or it wouldn't be a crisis, it would be some routine failure. So for COVID, for example, in the governors, which is what we looked at, most of them have not dealt with a global pandemic before, right? And so the more voices that you invite to the table, the better. So that's where that fostering of collaboration really becomes a key quality. And also, there was a big meta-analysis that looked at leadership styles of men and women, and that found that women tended to have a more democratic leadership style, whereas men tended to have a more autocratic.
Small d, not democratic party.
Not political party. No, just democratic in the sense of inviting people to the table, getting their input, more open to hear diverse views, whereas men tend to sort of assert power, kind of be in charge, less willing to hear others because they view it more as a challenge to their ego, if you will. If somebody else thinks they know something, how dare they, to be broad. And then the other two things, and where we focused in the study that we're going to talk about on the next slide, is empathy. In general, research finds that women tend to be more empathetic than men. And so from a leadership perspective, women leaders tend to do a better job at connecting with how their followers are feeling. And they tend to be more concerned about their welfare and speak to issues that are important to the followers versus just issues that are important to me, the leader. And then confidence is another one, that women leaders tend to exude more confidence that we can get through things, to be more optimistic and resilient, if you will. So this is what the literature had kind of said. And this is where we said, okay, let's test this with women governors and COVID. So what did we do? Well, to preview the conclusion, as you saw on the first slide, we did find that states with women governors had fewer COVID-19 deaths, and this was early in the pandemic. So the data, how did we test this? Everything was publicly available, which is great. It wasn't an experiment where we sent out a survey and we asked people. We got the COVID data from the New York Times, and then we got a bunch of governor data from the Governors Association. And then also, I think if you read, so this research, as Brian noted on the first slide, has generated a lot of media attention. And sometimes we read the comments and you get love and you get hate, right? And so sometimes you'll get someone saying like, oh, this is just a spurious correlation. It's not science, it's junk, right? Well, if you read the paper, it's not just a correlation that we were testing. We were actually controlling for a lot of other variables that people could say, well, what about this? What about this? What about this? And so by putting them in the equation, we isolate those effects. So we controlled for things like state population. This is bigger the state, probably the more COVID death. We controlled for political party, age and experience of the governors, whether the states had stay-at-home orders, whether there were face mask mandates, what the travel bans were, and whether the hospitals were participating in ventilator sharing to kind of control for the spread. So we controlled for all of these factors, and then gender as well, to say, so when we have all of these factors predicting COVID death, does gender still matter? And we found that it does. And we also found that there was an interaction with stay-at-home orders, that when women governors issued those early stay-at-home orders, people responded more positively to it by seeing that decrease in death, versus when men issued it, we didn't see that same decrease in death.
And just a quick one, control for means statistically, stats is going to equalize it, right? It would just say equalize this variable for both groups, right? So that therefore it cannot be the cause of the effect.
Yeah. So then, so that was our study one. But in research, a lot of times just showing an effect isn't really enough, because people really want to know why. And you probably are here too to say, okay, what can I take away from this? What could I do in my career? What can I learn? And so if we just say, oh, states with, women had lower death, and we don't say why, it's really hard to learn anything. So our study two is getting at, what do women do differently than the male governors that maybe led to less death in their state. So for this, again, we were looking at publicly available data. We went to a transcription site that was providing the transcripts of the governor briefings. And so we had over 250 briefings from almost all of the states, and in total over 1.2 million words spoken. And we analyzed those with what's called a linguistic text analysis. Basically, it's a pre-established dictionaries that you can run over text to say, are there significant differences on certain variables? And so what we were interested in is, are there differences in empathy, and are there differences in confidence? Because recall, those were two of the things that research had suggested women might be better at than men. And that is exactly what we found. When we analyzed those transcripts of the male governors and the women, we found that women showed more empathy. Specifically, they talked more about their followers' feelings, how their followers must be feeling, connecting with those feelings, and the concerns of their followers, which especially early in the pandemic, if you recall, was jobs. Am I going to be losing my job? Unemployment is through the roof. And money. How am I going to pay my rent? And the women governors were speaking significantly more about those issues than the male governors. And they also showed more confidence that we're going to get through this together, that there's going to be another side, that things will get better. Whereas we didn't see that from the men. And so study two informs study one, in the sense that people in those states seem to respond more positively to the women governors by staying home, by wearing their masks, by following the orders, probably in part, at least in part, right? We're not claiming this is the only reason, but in part because those governors showed more empathy and more confidence. So we saw that greater compliance. So Alex is going to kind of wrap up this first part of the overview of our findings, and then what we really want to spend most of the time on is hearing from you and your questions. And oh, we took that, never mind. Okay, never mind. So we can stop sharing the slides now and kind of talk about what does this mean in terms of leadership? What can you take away from it? What should companies do?
All right, so one thing, a few limitations. We don't want to overcall it, right? It's just one study. That's it. It needs to be replicated. We need more. So we're not saying this is it, the end of all conclusions, right? But if I may say, it was a pretty solid study. Why? Because published on one of the best journals, okay. The data was public. You see, that's the big one in our field. Data was public. Anyone can go back, get those data set, we report the analysis and try to reanalyze it, which means nobody was messing with data, clip here, clip there, whatever, to kind of find something that you want. So that's a really good, if you ask me, that's a good thing. Also, sometimes the variables are complicated and there is a lot of error if you measure them. Like if you measure psychological constructs, kind of like, I think you're high achiever, but boy, I don't know, let me give you a survey. Here, if you look at it on the predictor side, we have gender. Well, okay, we ought to be able to determine that, right? And on the criterion side, we had COVID death as officially reported by the state. So that's another one that I think brings some value to this in comparison to journalists just kind of writing whatever they want to write. But it certainly should be replicated. The big one, if you ask me, and forget it, there was our study. If we can really, really document that we can clearly differentiate leadership effectiveness in a crisis, that's major. That is absolutely major, because crisis is when push comes to shove, right? It's when everything is hunky-dory. I mean, I don't know that you ever think about leaders. Things are great. They're just humming along. We're doing great. But it's like, what about when we go down? Now what? Where do we go? Who's going to show us how? Who's going to boost the morale? All of that. So if we can actually come to some of those conclusions, that would absolutely be precious. It doesn't have to be us, whoever picks up on this. So that's kind of the big one here, right? And then there's quite a few sort of conversation points, and we can give you some, and then you can pick up on it, or you can ask whatever you want to ask. So the big one is, are men and women different, and what are they different on, and what are they the same on? So if you look at a lot of literature, it's like, oh, women are not different, they're not different, they're not different, they're not different. A lot of people are saying, why would they not want to be different? Well, they're same as men. Well, why wouldn't they want to be better than men? Why do they want to be same as men, right? Maybe there are aspects in a society out there that they're better than men. So there was a Forbes article just literally a week or two ago, and I think it was entitled, "Should we stop pushing women to be men? Let them just try to be who they are, and we'll study the differences and see where perhaps the differences in effectiveness are." And if you ask me, if this gets documented further, that women are better leaders in a crisis, that is huge. That is absolutely huge, because again, crises are what matters. And then the other big question is, if there are really differences in empathy and confidence and these variables that Kayla is talking about, where are they coming from? Is it nature? Is it nurture, right? Is it basically biology, in which case it's hard to learn? Or if it's socialization, then it can be learned. Then everybody else can become that, both for men and female sides, right? So that's another big one. And kind of the prevalent view is probably due to how two genders are socialized growing up. One is socialized, be assertive, be aggressive, go out. Other socialized, be a little more community oriented, be friendly, be whatever. I'm telling stereotypes here, but that's where we're at. So those are some of the big questions. So you're undergrads, you're at a good school. I've been at this school for 20 years. I've seen a lot of students, a lot of them made it, some haven't. So what are your thoughts on this? What are you even thinking about it? Not? Or if you want to twist this in terms of my class,
You have a student. I recognize John.
Oh, John is there. Hey, John. Sorry, I didn't recognize you. It's kind of like, where do you see a competitive advantage for yourself? Do you see you're the same as everyone else? So where is the source of your competitive advantage? If you want to become a manager or leader, what would that be? Are you going to tell me the same things? Like, oh, I went to UW. Well, a lot of people did. right? You say, well, whatever, I had a good GPA. Well, a lot of people have a good GPA. That's just great, right? So where would you look for competitive advantage? What differentiates you in terms of leadership potential? So that could be another angle from which we can tackle this. So we're at about, quite there, almost 30 minutes. So we would really like to chat with you, to be here for you, answer any questions you might have or not. Or I'm just mostly curious, do you even think about any of this or not?
Mostly he has a lot of questions and he's curious for you to get engaged, and he just listed them all. So we can start anywhere. I just want to underscore.
He does that to me all the time.
I just want to underscore the findings on empathy and confidence, since we have looks like an equal balance of men and women here. Mostly I didn't count. This is just what I see. But that we're not finding and saying that women are the only ones who can be better. What we find is that women tended to show more empathy and more confidence, which was related to them doing better in the crisis. But these are certainly things that men can do too. And so one of the questions he was getting at are, do those differences come out of socialization, or are they somehow inborn? Or a question could be, how do we make men more empathetic? Or should we focus on what our strengths are as men and what our strengths are as women, and how we complement each other? But so we can start with your questions, and then we can kind of pose these one at a time as we go along to get your take. But so what questions do you have on the research or the topic or anything that we talked about?
And John, if you want to go first, you have it.
I think he's probably heard this a little bit before.
I'm sure.
So he should be prepared with questions.
You're not going to call on me.
I guess I can start with a question. You talked a little bit about the need for this study to be replicated, and I'm wondering what might be another situation to test this, not given a pandemic where there's a clear outcome of success being fewer deaths. Would it just be kind of like what you indicated earlier with, maybe it's a company that's already going down, and do they survive kind of that trajectory of already free falling, or what's kind of the measure of success for replicating this study?
Yeah, that's a great question, because that was one unique part of this dependent variable being death, which is almost never the case, right? Maybe in medicine, but not in management studies, not in psych. And especially, like, how are you going to do experiments if you're going to manipulate and then you have death as a dependent variable? So it was an extremely unique context in which to study this. And not only obviously in the US, but globally. I mean, there are so many people affected by this, probably the largest psychological experiment that ever existed, right? In terms of stay-at-home orders, and because those things rarely happen in terms of personal liberties, right? So it was unbelievable context. So I don't think we're going to have death unless you're in medicine or anything like that. Although this study was reviewed by WebMD, and they put a bunch of MDs to review it, kind of like, is this plausible, right? From your perspective, is this plausible? And they not only supported it, they put it on their website, which was really nice because they have 10 million followers. So that was a nice little hint when they did that. But there could be other instances, obviously. It could be all kinds of natural disasters, it could be climate, it could be homelessness, it could be all kinds of different things. There are more of a societal crisis, right? Versus just falling profits.
So those are kind of the two streams. It can be replicated in businesses, but it can be replicated, like Alex said, with sustainability issues around climate, homelessness issues, gun violence, crime. There's all sorts of areas where it can be examined. The key, though, is for things to get published, they have to go beyond just replication. So it would be really hard to publish a study where you just want to look at, do women leaders do better than men on these different measures? Because what you're going to get back from reviewers is, well, what's new? What's different? And so just changing context is never enough to get a publication. You'd have to examine mechanisms that are different. So in addition to empathy and confidence, what else are women doing, and how is that helping them in those contexts? Or not? Does it flip in certain contexts? And if you found it flipped, you'd have to say why, right? And so the path of replication is needed, but it's long, and the bar for that is even high.
I would emphasize the empathy part, because I mean, if you talk to CEOs, empathy, they'd be like, what do you mean empathy? What is that? We don't do that in business, maybe a little bit. But if you think about it, it wasn't gender to save lives. It was the greater compliance by the state residents with early stay-at-home orders, right? So why is that critical? Well, stay-at-home orders, they were they're ordered, but it wasn't really enforced all that they would put you in jail or anything like that, but it was critical to do it. Yet that never happened in the US. Think about it. Of course, we had calamities, wars, calamities, 9/11, but we never had a restriction in civil liberties to this extent. Like you have to stay at home, right? I mean, if you think that never happened before. So for people to say, oh, okay, sure, I will, it's not necessarily the easiest compliance decision, right? So that's where the difference comes from. So I'm not going to name the governors, but if you read, of course, we read all kinds of briefings. One of the male governors is like, well, suck it up. Come on. It's a crisis. There's a problem. Just put up with it. Deal with it. Kind of like that. Similar. Versus a lot of female governors saying, hey, I feel your pain. I get it. I'm as annoyed as you are. Here's my phone. Call me. I'm not joking here. This is awful. But bear with me here. We got to do this. It's crisis. It's hell. We got to stay at home. I get it. I feel it. I don't want to stay at home either. Way more explaining, way more like I feel it. I'm with you versus, well, suck it up. It's a crisis, right? So I think that is the biggest angle. That's what people should focus on, potentially replicating. Because again, this was not an experiment. It was actual people in actual states doing something that was reasonably hard to do given history, given the precedent that we never had in terms of limitations of civil liberties. So I think that's, if we get something on that it's how you approach your followers, and it's not everything, here it is, here's the profit, go at it, get your sales going. I think we might be up to something really, really important and different, but that's just me.
Hi,
so are women more empathetic? Oh, sorry, go ahead, Ashley.
Oh, I have a question. I'm just curious about, because I know it's been typically shown that women face more of the issue of like imposter syndrome. So I'm wondering, when it comes to leadership, like what you guys noticed that possibly how maybe dealing with having this less sense of entitlement when it comes to leadership as men have, like feeling that it's been shown that like there's a lot of male leaders, so they feel like, oh, I can do this, versus women not having as many representation. So I'm wondering if those traits you found with empathy or something can be correlated maybe to the imposter syndrome that typically is shown in society for women.
Yeah, I'll give you my take, and then Kayla can. I don't think it's imposter. So there are two other explanations. Could be that there's a bottleneck. It's much harder for women to rise to those leadership positions. So comparatively speaking, for those women governors, they must be the toughest that there are, or they must be the best that there are. But because it's easier for men to get to those positions, maybe they're not as good. So maybe it's not gender, it's just they have more everything, right? More skills. It was harder for them to get there. So that's one. The other one was, and I'll address imposter too. The other one was that those states who have voted for female governors are sort of kind of even more advanced socially, if you wish. So they actually, because they're a little more socially advanced, they complied with the order saying, no, we get it, we understand, right? Which is why because they voted for females in the first place, like we're open-minded, right? We're open to all of this, and therefore they were more open to complying with the orders. The imposter system is defined as you have it, but you don't believe you deserve it. And so I don't know if that's...
So I want to jump on that. So what I think...
Clearly.
Well, you jumped to answer, and so I waited. But I think what you'd find, I think potentially, and this gets back to something Alex was saying earlier about like, should women stop trying to be like men? Or the article he read, that was the title of it. And I think with the imposter syndrome, like Alex just said, this feeling of you don't feel like you deserve it. might get back to what Ashley was saying about, when you look around, there's not a lot of women leaders. And so as you emerge, if you're experiencing imposter syndrome because you don't feel you deserve it, because there's not a lot there. And then you think, when you're looking to say, how should I act? How should I lead? And all of your models are men, because that's what's there. You might start to think, I don't deserve it because I'm not like them, right? And so one thing that I think is really interesting and that I like about this study that we found is like, you don't have to be like them to be successful, right? You can be empathetic, you can be confident, you can be different, and that can be super effective, especially in the crisis. And so if anything, I think the findings point to an overcoming of the imposter syndrome, a way of getting to realize you are good enough, and what you bring might be different, but it can be just as effective.
Others?
Do you guys think, I'm curious, as you're thinking about entering the workforce, have you thought about these things? Like, do I want to play to my strengths, or do you feel like there is this ideal of, even if it's not leader yet, or this ideal of like, I need to be like this? Have you thought about that? Like, is there a model that you're trying to follow, or are you just kind of playing to your own strengths? How do you see that, man or woman? Maybe you haven't thought about it.
Well, okay, kind of relating to your point, I'm a political science major, so like the fact that you studied governors is like particularly interesting to me, because like in some of my classes we've talked about the fact that like the way the media portrays women versus men when they have similar character traits just is, different. Whereas, men can be described as passionate, women can be described as aggressive or whatever. Just like the way people talk about, different politicians is incredibly gendered. So I think that it's interesting that you found this, because I think that there might be, more pressure on women to act, I guess, more level-headedly, because if they don't, they could be called a hothead, or, it's just interesting to hear that you have found this all. And I'm curious if that could also have something to do with, societal expectations and media portrayal of politicians. Like, do you have any thoughts on that at all?
I'll tell you, it just came out today, actually. I just read it this morning. It was a big study coming out that compared the media portrayal and the actual data on COVID. And they did in US first, and they went globally. And so basically what they did, let's say if the COVID is getting worse, I don't know, last April or May, right? The portrayal of it in the media should be somewhat parallel in general, right? It should be correlated. Well, like, hey, it's getting worse, right? But also if it's getting better in terms of, hey, cases are down, look at the vaccines, the thing is working. The coverage should have sort of be correlated in terms of portraying the news, and it's not. And it was today in Wall Street Journal. Happy to forward to anyone who wants it. They're finding that media is consistently negative regardless of the data on COVID. So even when the data is good, like it's getting better, the vaccines, they're all there, they're still negative. And then of course the reason was, why are they negative? Is it because the more negative news, the more people watch it, or is there a political bias, or who knows? So that's absolutely happening. And then of course they looked at globally, and it was more or less the same, meaning it might not be any particular political bias. It must just be the nature of the news. The more tragic things they give you, the more kind of disturbing, the more you're likely to watch it, versus saying, hey, we're doing better, moving on, go do something else. So that just came out today. So I don't know if there is more to it, but that was kind of interesting. But there is no doubt that men and women are afforded different attributions. I mean, especially if one is aggressive, this one is assertive, that's good. And this is aggressive, that's terrible, right? So there's no doubt about that.
I think the nice thing about the data we used in our study was words the governors actually spoke themselves. It wasn't the way that the media portrayed them. And so the governors themselves were more empathetic and more confident. Whether the media portrayed them that way or not would be a follow-up study that could be interesting, to your point. But I think at least our findings get around that portrayal, but absolutely. What other questions do you have?
Yeah, ask a question real quick. So going into the study, did any parts of it surprise you in any way or change the ways you think about leadership on like even a smaller scale, like for a business or even like a student organization like ours? I'm just wondering kind of how things compared to your original hypothesis and how it changed the way you think about things today.
Confidence was a big one for me, because that I study that's kind of been my thing, my research. And if you look at, and my students know it, John knows it. If you look at research on confidence, almost everywhere you're going to find that men are more confident than women, even unreasonably so, right? It's really actually, the gaps are huge, and they're even when women have more competence, they rate themselves lower on confident than men, right? So it's really not good. And so that was a big surprise. And when we read their statements, right, a lot of men governors were saying, well, we can't do it. There's nothing we can do about it. It's a global pandemic. It's a virus. We don't have a vaccine. That's it. Versus a lot of women's like, come on, of course we can do that. We get together, we get the experts, we sit at the table, we share the thing, but that's where the inclusion comes in. Bring different voices. I'm not afraid of different voices, right? Get the experts. Let's start talking. Versus typically men leaders would say, it's me, I know it. It's it. And buck stops with me, right? Well, I'm the one person, so what do I know about pandemic? Well, who knows, right? Versus like, come on in, everybody, whoever can. So that was another huge one. That was because that's typically not the case in other research literature to find that women are more confident. So it was incredible.
Yeah, and I think for me, surprise in a sense of the implication or the takeaway, because when we're doing the research, we're like really in the nuts and bolts of it, right? Like cranking the data, looking at the transcripts, writing the paper. And then at the end, when you sit back and you say, okay, what does this mean? Like, what does this mean for society, or what does this mean for leaders, or what does this mean for people entering the workforce? The thing that I really like that I didn't see at the outset was that it sends a message of whatever your leadership style is, you can be effective in the right context, right? So especially for women, this idea that, because a lot of women leaders think that to be a leader, they need to be more agentic and more assertive. And the women that rise are those women that are assertive and have an edge and have a knife. And so if you're not one of them, if you are somebody who is more communal, or, just more, you like input from others, you second guess yourself sometimes, so you want more opinions, you're more democratic. I think the thing that I really like is the study says, there are situations where you are needed and you should step up, right? And so when you look around the room and you might think, oh, I shouldn't be the leader because I'm more empathetic, what makes me softer, or I'm not assertive, I'm not autocratic. I think what this study says is, no, you are needed. You need to step up. We need you, and we need your style in this context. And I really like that. And I didn't see that at the outset.
And that's one thing we're saying. No, women are more flexible, period. They're simply better at creativity. They're more flexible at handling psychological crises. I mean, that's a fact. That's not new. Well, how is that not important in a societal crisis, right? Because if you look at how men, let's say, handle crisis of failure, it's no good, right? So I'm either no good, or I'm a loser, or I have a big L, or I'm failure, something like that. And they usually not recover. Versus women are way more likely to say, whoa, is there a different perspective to this, right? Are there different angles to take a look at from this? Whom else can we bring into this situation to see if they can help us out? Well, that's the key to solving crisis. It's not I'm this whatever famous general leader, I know it all.
I win Emmys for my speech.
Yeah, sure, that's important. But it's bringing the experts to it and saying, can we pull it together for something that nobody really has experienced, which was COVID? That's absolutely critical. And there's absolutely evidence that women are more creative. So that's kind of where I would go with research to say, what are other contexts? What are they that we can examine and study this? But come on, guys, push back. We have a good 20 minutes here. Or not.
I have a question. So how would you say your research applies to other cultures in different countries? Because I know you found that leaders here in America and the governors who are women were more affected by being empathetic leaders, but how do you think this applies to other cultures?
So there was a study that came out a few months after ours that looked at global leaders, and they did find the same effects. They found that countries with women heads of state had less COVID-19. So it has been replicated beyond just the US at that global level. So I don't see any reason that it wouldn't. I think in certain cultures, you're going to face more barriers and it's going to be much harder, right? But the effect itself, at least according to the follow-up research that was conducted, seems to hold.
There's the other one, which is kind of interesting, like what's more accepted. And that was in the paper in some versions, but that at the end didn't make it with the editors. It was, so let's say in general, if we say in US, women have more empathy than men, most accept that. Both men and women accept that. They're like, yeah, that kind of, it seems reasonable. We agree with that. If you tell them in let's say Western or whatever, in US, women have more confidence, which is not to be expected. Quite a few say, that's interesting. Like, tell me more. At least they're not denying it. There are cultures out there that would deny it immediately for men. They're like, nope, men are not empathetic. Forget about it. They're just not. But they would accept it more for women and the other way around, right? If you say women are confident, they're more likely to reject that than to even consider it. If that makes sense, what I was just saying. There is more pushback for certain things, and there is less pushback for certain other things. And it's just purely cultural. Purely, like if you examine it here and there, you're going to get different results.
Based on the norms.
Yeah, based on social norms, So what would you say? Would you say, again, I'm just curious, are women more empathetic than men? Nobody. So those of you who are not doing anything, is it because it's recorded, or you just don't want to, or you don't think so, or? So I'm curious. Anybody wants to pick it up? No?
I guess a follow-up question would be, do you think that, like, given the study, given the findings, should men who are in leadership positions work to be more empathetic, or should men focus on their own strengths and, forget trying to be empathetic? Like, do you see this as like something like the genders should try to, act in ways that the situation calls for, or should they act on their own strengths? Or like, where do you see the give and take here?
Oh, is there a give and take?
Yeah.
Yeah, I can say something. Yeah, I would definitely agree with like for leaders. So men should definitely try to be more empathetic, but I think the importance is on like adaptability, flexibility, trying to see the situation or the environment and figuring out what kind of leadership that it calls for. So I remember from class, a big thing was, I think it was like, I'm trying to remember, I think like Fiedler's model, where it's like the leader situation fit, and just being able to recognize the different factors that would either call for like more collaboration and bringing in like different like experts versus a situation where a lot of people would depend more on like a singular like figure and just depend on them telling what to do.
To reinforce John's point, so when we talk in class, there's this model basically saying leadership effectiveness is about fit, right? And Fiedler is the guy who developed it. And the example we use is if you look at Churchill before the war, and I'm using Churchill because I'm assuming everybody knows him. He was considered to be not quite part of the establishment, too rambunctious for British political establishment, kind of bully, if you wish. And nobody ever thought that he would rise to be a prime minister. Maybe some secretarial, not secretarial, like a secretary of the this or that, but never a prime minister. Until Chamberlain was negotiating with Hitler about Czechoslovakia, came back, and there's this one person saying, no, it's just all I can promise is blood, sweat, and tears. We got to fight it to the end. And all of a sudden, when the environment changed, right? The pressure was more imminent. It's going to happen. All of a sudden, that personality, oh, well, that's not bad to have as a prime minister. Of course, he's prime minister, probably a legendary, I would say. He's not the only one. There are others. War hero, absolutely, did really great. What happens in the elections in 1946? He loses. An absolute shock. How can this legend lose? They go to talk to people and they say, no, we still love him. We just think maybe someone else might be a little more appropriate in the post-war years, economic development, rebuilding and all that. So that's the fit, right? That you can be an absolute fit and then not a fit anymore, depending on, so it doesn't mean you're better or worse. It just means what you bring to the table, as John was saying, may be a fit. And if it's a fit, you're more effective. And if it's not, you're not. But it doesn't mean that either wouldn't count. Now, of course, he's elected again in 53. But then again, the environment might have changed. So that's kind of the big one on the fit thing. You buy that? Or you think there are universal leadership qualities?
I guess a thought I had, just maybe not really into this specific question, but in general, is I would love to look more into like the nature versus nurture kind of debate. And reality really is both. And like John said, like leadership is very context dependent, and like I think different leaders, different skills will excel more in different environments, such as like right now, it's like, it's a good time to be empathetic. You know, we're in a global pandemic, people want empathy and understanding. However, you brought up the point earlier that like across, like universally, that women exhibit these qualities over men. And that kind of makes me interested into seeing like, are these like kind of gender roles universal across the world, or that exists in America? I'd be interested to see that and really dig in deep. Because if it's not universal, just America, if it's not, you know, just America that's seeing these kind of gender roles and gender stereotypes, such as like, we hear a lot like, you know, men shouldn't cry and stuff like that. Like men are kind of raised the expectation of being tougher, at least from what I've seen in my life. But I'd be interested to see if like that exists worldwide, or really is like, no matter, you know, what the gender roles, gender stereotypes are in a country, whether it does have to do with nurture and just biological differences. So that was like really, that was pretty fascinating for me to hear, at least, and be curious to hear your thoughts on that as well.
Well, I think it would be interesting both ways. Even if you find it that these roles are very similar, it still does not necessarily prove, if you wish, or show causality that it was genetic. I mean, it could still be that they're just socialized very similarly across the world, right? That the genders are socialized kind of this way or that way. Now, of course, the problem is we can't do experiments, right? We cannot have two groups of babies and we socialize these this way and these that way to see the differences. So that'd be hard to point to that. But there is still that point. Is it really? Because if you read, the more you read that literature, it makes a lot of sense, right? Like you grow up in a certain family, in a certain community, and they're saying you behave this way, you behave that way. And over time, the society then reinforces that, right? Because they're kind of social stereotypes. So the more you do it, the more it's reinforced. You turn out to be 20, 21, 25, and that's kind of what you do. But it's really hard to disentangle. Is it the nature deep down? Or is it just simply how we socialize boys and girls, in which case that could change, or the other ones can learn it? If it's nature, that's a whole different story. But I think it would still be interesting, even if you knew it, to see it and to what extent. It's one or the other.
Yeah, I don't know. Well, yeah, well, I don't know if you could ever disentangle it. So, for example, we have a 10-month-old baby who's a boy, and at daycare yesterday, the woman says, like, just so you know, like he did try to, you know, bite another baby in the face.
Come on.
And I'm mortified, like, oh my God. And he comes home and his dad is like, oh, good for him. Wonder what that other baby was doing. And his brother's like, oh, good job. And I'm like, no, not good job, right? Like, and if it was a girl,
Cannot be a pushover.
I don't know.
Push back.
I don't know. Not like good job for like hurting, but you know
We
what I
were
mean? Like
kidding.
standing
We were
up for
not
yourself.
serious.
I know it was a joke, but still, right? So like the socialization, what I'm getting at here is the socialization starts way earlier than you'd ever think, like at babies, right? Like, so how you would ever disentangle, like, are boy baby and girl babies born with different tendencies, or is it socialized to reinforce certain tendencies and not others that over time accumulate? I mean, I don't know how you would ever disentangle that. But that's just my thought, being
we can't do an experiment,
mom.
right? So
Yeah, even things like, you know, if the baby like farts or something, if it's a boy, you're like, oh, he's just a boy, and if it was a girl, you'd be like, oh, you know, I don't, not that you do it consciously, but when you're parents, or if you are, I think you'll observe the way that parents socialize their babies. I don't think it's conscious. I think it's subconscious, but it is different. That's why I was giggling.
that was a great question, by the way. That's the kind of motherhood and apple pie kind of question, you know, where are these differences coming from? I mean, anyone else? Few minutes that we have. What are some of your experiences? Do you have any personal experiences along the lines of this, or not really, not yet, too early? Or what do you expect at work? I'm just curious, maybe. What do you expect to find, if anything? I know jobs, don't tell me that. Some of you are kind of like, it looks like maybe, you know, you're pondering Ebby here, kind of coming up and down, and but anything else that we can maybe answer in the last 5 minutes that we have?
Yeah, I have a question. I was wondering if you guys considered in your study also just kind of like the politics in the United States, about how, I guess compared to other countries, I'm not like super well versed on this, but I have a feeling that like the US kind of idolizes politicians more. And so do you think reason why a lot of politicians, like governors, for example, maybe presidents, they don't want to get feedback from other people because they want to like get themselves got us through the crisis? Like if you think about like Cuomo wrote a book during the crisis about how he handled the crisis. So I was just wondering like just what your thoughts on that, about the whole kind of politics in the US.
It's hard to, because we didn't study the other countries explicitly, but I feel, and Alex might know.
Well, I'll tell you, I mean, absolutely, right? All the politicians know there's media out there. And the more you're in the media, that somehow means you're more important, unfortunately or unfortunately, right? They send Twitter their likes. So whether that's right or not, but it's there. It certainly is. And they're humans like the rest of us. And I have no doubt when they are behind the closed doors, they're like, well, you don't have nearly as many likes as I do. I mean, clearly, nobody listens to you. So there is no doubt they pander to media, at least not all, of course. But I think, would it be fair to say that a lot of them do? I think absolutely. Because then the media brings notoriety. The notoriety, maybe you can run for a higher office. People know you. And of course, in politics, that's really, really important because people vote. In business, it may not be, because necessarily the company you're running, I don't know that they're voting, right? But in politics, the more you spread your name out, the more people know you, the more likely they're to vote for you. There's no doubt, I think.
But there's definitely politicians, I mean, like Thatcher comes to mind, right? Who was she didn't want any feedback. She wanted everything her way. And so I don't know that you could say like it's just America or not. And I think there's definitely politicians in the US that want to be known for being inclusive and listening to voices. And I think that's one of the things we saw with the transcript briefings. Like, these were public communications from governors to state residents, and we found women speaking more about their followers versus about themselves, right? So I don't think I would give a blanket statement like in the US the politicians are more focused on promoting themselves. I think it depends on the person, and I think that probably depends on the person across the globe, right?
They're everywhere. They're there wherever the media is important. I don't know most of the world, but let's say wherever media has some heft, a lot of them are trying to stay on a good side of the media, at least not to get on the bad side of the media, right? I mean, that might not be good for your career at all. I'm not saying it's good or bad, just for better or worse. Anything else? One last one? That was a good one, okay.
So if we were to leave you with a couple takeaways then of just things to think about, really, am I empathetic? Am I an empathetic leader? Do I have a tendency to assert my own power and control, or do I have a tendency to invite others to the table? Where do I fall? And is that what I want to be? And depending on your answers to that question might help you figure out where is a fit for you, right? What context fits your leadership style? What might be some things you want to work on? What might be some strengths you want to play on?
And I'll leave you with another thought, and I'm not plugging in my class because I won't be teaching it at least for a few years, but think of leadership as a source of competitive advantage. Because again, I got kids. Some just graduated, some in college, some coming up. And they're like, oh, I'm going to a good school, and that's great. And so are a lot of other people. Oh, I have my major in X, so do other people from same or better schools, right? So that's kind of the obvious. You need that, absolutely, to run the functional part of whatever it is that you're studying. But do ponder whether you take a class, whether you can or not, some other, is there something to that? The leadership skill could be a competitive advantage that can help you down the road when you hit the organizations, in addition to your functional skills. Right? So I just like to leave you with that thought for what it's worth.
Awesome.
I would recommend the class. Oh, sorry.
What do you say? What do you say, John?
Oh no, I highly recommend taking the class.
Oh, thank
MHR
you.
365.
I did not text him that. Thank you. We did not send him that in the chat. It's good seeing you, John. Well, good seeing you all, guys. If anything, Henry, you're in charge. Go ahead.